Greetings and welcome to another lecture in Introductory Psychology. This one deals with the two different types of research that goes on in all science, not just psychology. And this gets a little complicated because non-scientists tend to think that there is basically one type of research and they call it an experiment, when in actuality there are different types of research and they go by different names. The trick is to not confuse these. There's two broad categories of research in psychology, and in science in general, one would assume. And the trick is to not confuse them, to not think that one does what the other does, because they do very distinct different things. Part of the problem is that one of these types of research is basically named what is a synonym for most people for research, the experiment. Now, in science, an experiment is a very, very specific thing. It is a type of research that has been set up to allow the researcher to get cause and effect. And indeed, you would think this is why most researchers do research, particularly in something like psychology that has a medical tinge to it, or at least an applied basis. If I do this, this will happen. Okay, this causes that, so that if that is something good, we can do this, or if it's something bad, we can not do this. The thing is, though, in order to run an experiment, it's kind of tricky. You have to make sure that your cause is the only thing that could be. We're getting into why here. There's a little hint of how and when and that sort of thing, but this is why things happen, okay? This causes this, that causes that, this and that cause this, which causes that, which feeds into this, and we have a huge loop. Whatever it is, it's why things happen. Now, in order to be able to say that A causes B, which is what an experiment wants to do, in order to be able to say that A causes B, you have to rule out all other causes except for A. Okay? You have to rule out C and D and E and all the way down into ad infinitum or ad nauseum, depending on how you look at it. So you need to do what scientists call control. You need to make sure that the only thing that could be causing B is A. And the entire experiment revolves around that. Experiments are difficult because it's difficult to control for everything except for one particular thing. But that indeed is what an experiment is supposed to do. It's also why virtually all experiments are run in laboratories, where you have controlled circumstances, where you can hopefully control all those other causes. The problem, of course, is that you can't necessarily do all research as an experiment. Sometimes it's physically impossible to do something. Sometimes, and a lot of times, it's ethically impossible. For instance, for a very, very long time, researchers got away, well, not researchers, but tobacco lobbyists got away with saying that there is no conclusive scientific evidence that smoking causes cancer. And you know what? They were absolutely right, because there was no conclusive scientific evidence that smoking caused cancer. Because in order for there to be that, you would have to run an experiment where you would take a couple of groups of people and have one smoke cigarettes, force that group to smoke cigarettes. Hopefully they were all non-smokers at the start, because you have to control for everything. And so you force this one group to smoke 2 packs a day and then see how much cancer they get, which would be a lovely experiment in Nazi Germany. We can't do stuff like that, okay? What can we do? Well, we can observe people who choose to smoke and see what their rate of cancer is next to people who choose not to smoke. It's not an experiment, but it gives us information. The same kind of brouhaha is going on in a very few places currently, and has in the past, about whether or not HIV, the human immunodeficiency virus, actually causes AIDS. There have been a very few scientists who have suggested that in actuality, HIV does not cause AIDS. It simply is a marker to show that there is something else going on that is the actual cause. And of course, the way to prove that HIV causes AIDS is to take a group of uninfected people and inject them with HIV and see if they develop AIDS, which we cannot do. We cannot do that. Please don't do that. Okay? There's been this kind of similar research, a similar question, is fetal alcohol syndrome. How much alcohol Can a woman drink before her child develops fetal alcohol syndrome? Well, of course, we could do that as an experiment. We could take different groups of pregnant women and give them differing amounts of alcohol and then measure. I hope you're horrified at all of these things I'm telling you. I'm horrified at saying them. Okay? So therefore, how do we study smoking and cancer? By the way, they figured out a way to test that. They took lung cells from a human and cultured them in the laboratory and covered them with tobacco smoke, and those cells became cancerous. So technically, the tobacco lobbyists could still say there's no scientific test that smoking causes cancer in a living human being, but I think they gave up on that line of argument. So how do we research that? We don't do an experiment. We do what's called descriptive research, which is also sometimes called correlational research. Now, descriptive research is named after what it does. It describes the data. You could say, well, I'll do a survey, and of the people who smoked X percentage had some form of cancer, while people who didn't, only X percentage, probably a smaller percentage, had some form of cancer. Now, that's not proof that smoking causes cancer, mind you. Okay, because it's possible that maybe it's not the smoking that directly causes the cancer. People who smoke, for instance, also tend to drink alcohol. Maybe it's the alcohol. Maybe it's a combination of the smoking and the alcohol. Maybe it's something else. Maybe people who are more likely to become dependent on nicotine have some genetic predisposition to cancer that also causes them to become more dependent on nicotine. We can't tell for sure from a correlation, because correlation does not give cause and effect. Descriptive research just tells you what you have. Now, it can show that there is a connection between two or more things, and it does that quite nicely. There is a whopping huge correlation between infection with HIV and developing AIDS, between drinking alcohol, although we still don't know how much alcohol. Safety would recommend that pregnant women drink absolutely no alcohol, but a lot of us had moms that not only drank alcohol but also smoked cigarettes, and we turned out okay, but we can't know that that's true, and so therefore, and in order to know how much, again, you'd have to do an experiment, but we do know that women who drink during pregnancy have a much more likely chance of having a child with the collection of traits that we call fetal alcohol syndrome. Now, exactly how these relate together, exactly this relationship, is in form of a number called a correlation. I've recorded a separate lecture on correlations, so I'm not going to spend a huge amount of time on them here. But a correlation simply tells you that two things are related. It doesn't tell you how. It doesn't give you cause and effect. It simply tells you that when this happens in this thing, this often happens in this thing, which can tell us a lot. We can tell that things are connected. We just can't always tell how. Now, this is a problem because a lot of people, particularly in the media, don't get this. Okay? And so they will come out, and when a researcher has said, well, there's a correlation between two things, the media and other people who don't understand this will go running around saying, see, this causes that, when in actuality it doesn't cause that. All we know is that they are linked. We don't know how. It could be that A causes B, it could be B causes A, it could be A and B are both caused by C, it could be they have almost nothing to do with one another. So whenever you're watching the news or reading on the internet and you see research that said it shows a link between these things, that's a correlation. It's a correlation. Don't then say that A causes B, and don't believe it when someone else tries to tell you that yourself. Okay? All a correlation tells you is that these two are connected. In order to be able to tell that A causes B, you have to run an experiment. And sometimes, quite frankly, you can't tell from reading on the internet whether or not it was descriptive research or an experiment. Sometimes you got to go look it up yourself and see if they controlled for all of those variables. Because in order to have cause and effect, you have to control for everything else that might cause. If you don't control for everything else that might cause, you have descriptive research, not an experiment. Okay? So I probably just confused you more. Remember, an experiment gives you cause and effect because you rule out everything except that one cause. Descriptive research does not do that. It does not rule everything out. It simply tells you that two things are related in some way.